You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 299 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer, and I'll be your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host, and he's my cousin. He's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going very well here in Winter Wonderland.
We will get to it. I want to hear about the Wonderfest that's going on, whatever it's called, at Wrigley Field. I do want to touch on that later, but we've got a lot to cover. We're going to run down the happenings of the offseason since last we spoke. We're going to speculate a little bit on what the Cubs' rest of their offseason could look like, and we'll talk about the Wonderfest happening right now at Wrigley Field. But before we get to any of that, I want to bring on longtime friend of the show. You know him from all of his baseball writings and appearances here, Matt Trueblood. Thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs and baseball with us tonight.
Always a pleasure, and I'm ruminating now on. I did not realize how close you guys were getting up to this next milestone. So I look forward to hearing whether it is Evan or Ryan in 300 in the heated rivalry. This is good stuff.
That's right. For 300, we have to re-pull the stats and the totals and see where people are at right now. We've got we are starting our 10th season having a podcast covering your Chicago Cubs. So big milestones all over the place. Running up on 300, starting our 10th year doing this podcast, Pat. It's time flies when you're having fun.
Otherwise known as a decade of dominance, Jeremy.
That's right. Longest running weekly Cubs podcast. So yeah, it's great
in America.
It's
right.
And we will have plenty of shows coming up to talk all about the history of this podcast and where we came from, where we're going. But today we need to talk about the offseason, Pat. Why don't you catch us up? Last time we had a podcast, we were just wrapping up the World Series.
Yeah, it's been a little while since we've podcasted, so I just wanted to kind of do a quick 3-minute maybe run through of what's been going on, and then from there we can, I think, move to the off season. And I think I'll start just a little bit before the season ended, because I think people may have missed it towards the end of the season and the malaise of September. But the Cubs released Frank Schwindel, Wonder Kid, who had a wonderful 2021 storybook season, but then came back to earth last year and it was released. We also saw the release of Jason Hayward, who I think the Cubs had telegraphed pretty well that he was not going to be coming back because they had a going away party for him before the season ended. So the Cubs will be on the books, or he'll be on the books for the Cubs for this next season, and then his contract will be gone, 8th year of the deal. We also saw the Cubs part ways with Wilson Contreras. They had offered him a qualifying offer, which he obviously declined and is now a free agent. We can talk a little bit about that too. The Cubs' compensation for that will be a fairly low-level draft pick. A little disappointing. The Cubs also have, at least in temporarily, parted ways with Drew Smyly. He had a really good season with the Cubs in his 106 innings pitched. There was a mutual option on the table, which he declined for obvious reasons. I think he's going to be looking for a multi-year contract, and there is some speculation the Cubs may actually work out a deal with him and bring him back. We'll see how that fares. Cubs also parted ways with Wade Miley. You may remember just about a year ago when the Cubs picked him up and picked up his $10 million deal because he had been let go by the Reds. And at the time, we thought that was a great move to get basically a number 3 starter for a fairly reasonable amount. I still think it was a good move, although it just didn't work out. He pitched fine. Unfortunately, he only pitched 37 innings. So it was the rest of the time when he was injured that made that a disappointing season for him and for us. The Cubs also more recently have parted ways and released Rafael Ortega, who was another person with speculation at the trade deadline. Probably couldn't move him, as it turns out, and and have since released him. Fermil Reyes, remember when the Cubs signed him midseason from the Cleveland Guardians, and he had a very hot first couple weeks, and we were very excited and pumped, and he had a track record of hitting a lot of home runs, and then he came back down to earth and produced as he had with the Guardians, which is why they released him in the first place, and the Cubs didn't pick up, I think it was like a $7 million option for him. So he is gone. Michael Hermosillo, who local product, has a picture of him with Sammy Sosa from the suburbs. He was also let go. Cubs had a couple other, I wouldn't call them surprise releases, but certainly for some probably. Braylon Marquez, who was the Cubs' #1 prospect just 2 years ago, was released. He was the flame-throwing pitcher who actually came up at the very tail end of the 2020 COVID season and pitched, I think, in a game, maybe two. And he had suffered from a lot of injury issues and COVID issues and maybe some effort issues, I think.
Some personality
speculated
issues.
From the,
Yeah.
some things I've heard from whispers from the Cubs organization. So he is now gone, as is another odd case, Alexander Vizcaino. You may remember him. He was one of the 2 players the Cubs got in the Anthony Rizzo trade. He just kind of doesn't want to play baseball, maybe. Hard to say. But he certainly didn't want to pitch for the Cubs, and he just kind of sat out. So he's been released. And then I guess technically it was probably late August. We lost Greg Dykman. We hardly knew you, Greg. He was the return in the Chafin trade, the Andrew Chafin trade from 2020, and he was a kind of a AAA guy who the Cubs were hoping would develop some more power. And instead, he just kind of had a really, really rough year. He's kind of getting older too, so Cubs released him. Cubs also had a couple notable injury issues since we last spoke. First, Brendan Davis, who was the Cubs' #1 prospect this last year, the year after Braylon Marquez. A lot of high hopes for him in 2022. Struggled mightily in Iowa to start the season in AAA. Then had an injury. They call it a back injury, but some people get mad if you say that because I guess there was some sort of weird cyst of some sort on his back that had to be surgically removed. In any event, he did try to come back at the end of the year and then was having more, I say back in quotation marks, issues at the Arizona Fall League, so they shut him down. His status is unknown, so that's a little bit concerning as to what's going on there. And then I think probably one of the most promising Cubs prospects who had a wonderful season in 2022, Alexander Canario, was injured in a ghastly play, running to first base. He twisted, I didn't say twisted his ankle, he mauled his ankle and separated his shoulder all in one play. He's going to miss the entire 2023 season. That's a real bummer because I think there have been hopes that we would have seen him at the major league level at some point this season. So that's a big blow. He reminds me of former 2020 first-round draft pick Ed Howard, who also had a ghastly hip injury running to first base, trying to avoid a throw about a year ago. He missed basically the entire season this last season as well. So these are some of the injury absences, I think, that are sort of like, at least for the short term, going to have an impact on the Cubs offseason. And the Cubs offseason, I guess on the positive side, the good news is that the Cubs have a lot of money they can spend, and they also have a lot of places they can spend it. So, the Cubs are going to need a catcher, a middle infielder, probably a shortstop. They're going to need a center fielder. They're going to need probably a couple starting pitchers. They most likely should get some help at first base because really their first baseman, I think on paper right now, would be Matt Mervis, but he's never played in Major League Baseball. So you may want to have somebody else there to help shore that up. You're going to need maybe some help for Patrick Wisdom at third base, but with all the other holes, it's hard to see if they will get that far on the to-do list. Relief pitcher, a veteran relief pitcher might be nice, at least from my perspective. Not just a reclamation project. They've been very good at those the last couple of years, but maybe even somebody who you have some thoughts that you could actually spend a couple $1 million to get, who will be helpful to help anchor or at least stabilize what's going to be a very young bullpen. So I don't know if I missed anything or if you have any other observations, but that's sort of where I see the offseason so far.
That is a lot, and a lot of transactions. The Cubs are still flirting with their challenges around the 40-man roster, even with those last three players you mentioned, Ortega, Vizcaino, and Marquez. The Braylon Marquez one is, you mentioned it. That one's the most surprising. And it's something it's a cautionary tale for a lot of these prospects that we get excited about in a time where the Major League Ball Club is terrible. You look at the prospects, you get excited about them, but there's a guy that you almost had penciled in as a contributor to the Cubs, and he's nowhere. Played one game, like you mentioned. It can go sideways with these prospects.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because and I'll let Matt talk here, because I know we have him as a guest. But thank you for pointing that out, because I think we've seen between the injuries to Miguel Amaya, the Braylon Marquez situation, the injury to people like Howard and Brennan Davis and Canario, and then you've got the Caleb Killian phenomenon, where he was so good in the minors last year, came up to the majors, got rocked, went back to the minors, lost complete control of his pitches. You see that it's a lot harder than it looks sometimes. I mean, I went back through last year, and I found the Cubs had 4 true rookies last year. In Hayden Wisniewski, who pitched 33 innings, pitched quite well, starting pitcher. Javier Assad, who pitched 37 innings and pitched fairly well. Brandon Hughes, who pitched 57 innings out of the bullpen and was solid. All 3 of those, by the way, outperforming their peripherals. I don't know what that means. I don't know if there's going to be regression there, or if it's just they can make up for that because they're young and get better. And then, of course, Christopher Morel was the shining star of the position player, somebody who wasn't really even on the radar, I think, for a lot of people going into the season. He had a very hot start and then cooled off dramatically, and then kind of had a decent end to a season. So, yeah, those were the 4 guys who actually came up and contributed. And most of the people we expected to contribute, certainly Davis and Killian, were top 2 on the list. And like you said, Marquez was right behind him. And they were of no help. So you have to be careful. I'm not hearing as much on Twitter like I did last offseason, that if the Cubs try to go out and get a shortstop and sign to a 7-year deal, that it's a bad idea because they'll be blocking so and so, some 18-year-old, and
I hate that. That's the worst.
Some 18-year-old in the Arizona Fall League, or not even Fall League, but the Summer League or whatever. No, I think people are starting to kind of recalibrate, and there's nothing like having a losing season and having to watch the team suck basically for a second straight year to kind of get people a little bit anxious and want to start to see some improvements and maybe not want to just kind of tank for 5 years, because as we've seen, for a lot of Cubs fans who are younger and came of age in that 2014-15, that magical era where all the Cubs young players showed up at the majors and played well and did well, or most of them did, and they made some great trades, and they were the Cubs and the Astros were able to take this tanking idea and make it work. But we forget sometimes the other 70 examples of teams trying to tank in the last decade where it hasn't worked. So high risk, high reward there. And the Cubs are fortunate that they're a big market team, and they've got the money they can spend to make up for some of the shortcomings they might have in the farm system, and or some of the players have been derailed by injuries. So I guess Matt will tell us what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, there was a lot in there, and you're right. It's been a flurry of hellos and goodbyes, and we can dig more into what it means for their off season shortly. But a couple of things that each of you just touched on that I think is worth teasing out. You were rattling off Dykeman sort of rolling through and off the roster. Vizcaino sort of ending up in a strange limbo throughout this year and now gone from the organization. The misfortune that has this year befell both Canario and Killian. I do want to highlight, and I guess give credit where it's due. I have not always been a proponent of the way Jed Hoyer conducts himself when it comes to trades, and there are still things I'd like to see him change about that. But one thing he consistently does is something that Bob Howsam was famous for when he was building the Big Red Machine for the Reds 50 plus years ago. Anytime there's a trade on the table, something you're going for, Jed likes to get an extra player. He prefers when he can to trade for two guys with, sort of differing levels, but some level in each person of promise, instead of trading for one guy who might be a solid but low ceiling contributor. And that has paid off because, sure, in Canario and Killian's case, you sort of ended up with snake eyes at the end of this year, but it was looking really good for each of them for different stretches. And you can't control things like injuries. You also give yourselves more rolls of the dice when you have multiple guys in a trade. And that really looks impressive when you turn to the Chafin deal where, yeah, they got Greg Deichmann for him. They also got a guy named Daniel Palencia. I think that's the name.
Yeah.
Throws about 102 with a pretty good slider. And they still have him in the rotation right now. And he'll probably start next year in South Bend with a good chance of getting to Tennessee. And he's one of those guys where if there's any wobble in terms of health or efficiency, and you just move him into the bullpen, he's going to move really fast, and he's going to be a really impressive relief weapon. So you got
and he was the guy who was the throw-in in that deal, right? Like he was right. Deichmann was the major piece. He was the secondary piece.
Exactly. But the throw-in is going to be the headliner of that deal, and it could be a really good headliner for half a season of a middle reliever. And then in the Rizzo deal, you maybe didn't have access to the Yankees' top tier of prospects. So what Hoyer did was mine their middle tier, and he got Vizcaino, which didn't work out, but he also got Kevin Alcantara, who, as we know, the Cubs added him to the 40-man roster, sort of replacing Vizcaino in a way
right.
this month in order to protect him from the Rule 5. He's maybe their third best prospect. It really depends on who you ask, but in that echelon, still kind of far from the majors, farther than you'd like a guy to be when you're adding him to the 40-man. But that's the only knock on him at this point. There are prospect people who are just enamored of his combination of size and coordination and power potential. And when you are able to get two guys in a deal, now it's not always possible. And Jed's done a pretty good job when it's been a 1-for-1 situation too, where it's like, all right, I'm not going to get exactly the guy I might have wanted here, but let me, whether it's packaging two guys to get PCA in Javi and Trevor Williams in 2021, or whether it's this past year getting creative and trading a reliever with a bunch of control attached to him, and Scott Efros for Hayden Wesneski. He's done pretty well at the 1-for-1 type of thing too, but I really like the way he's gone out of his way to grab that extra player with some real, not just that lottery ticket kind of thing that every young prospect has, but some guys with something to really build on, bring them into the organization. And it's paid off a couple of times already, or at least it's paid off in that way that it can pay off in such a short window where we at least have that to cling to and say, you got something meaningful from the player you traded away there.
Do you think that also can work against Hoyer in the sense that there are times perhaps when he doesn't get what he thinks he should be getting for a player, so he just keeps the player?
I think that's one of the complaints I was alluding to, that we've been talking about that ever since he took over, and almost even before that. I feel like there was a phase of what was still technically the Epstein-Hoyer regime where you felt Jed's greater conservatism in team building, and especially in high-level player acquisition, taking over for Theo's tendency to go a little bigger or trust his gut a little more on a player, even if it took the extra dollar or the extra talent to acquire him. Jed doesn't often do that. But I also think, sometimes things are going on behind the scenes that lead us to erroneous evaluations too. I mean, one thing you didn't mention in that recap, because there's too many things to mention, right? But the story that came out just after the World Series. I mean, literally
the
day after
the Dusty
World
Baker
Series.
story about Contreras. Is that
Right? Although
yeah, I was
I
saving
wanna
that for
say-
you guys.
yeah, I want to say too that before people jump on Dusty one more time, just because
Your
we're
buddy,
Cubs fans and
we know you love
his
Dusty.
his tenure with us was the nadir of his career, which is a bummer. That's a bummer to think about.
Right.
Like there are too many people who the only bad seasons of their entire career in baseball come with the Cubs, but that's another conversation. I think Jim Crane blocked that deal as much as Baker did.
Yeah.
But that deal, which would have brought the Cubs Jose Urquidy for Contreras, would have been a great deal for the Cubs. And I think the reason that no trade happened at all for Contreras was partially about the Mets not ponying up what Hoyer demanded at the last second, but more about
and it cost him.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And the Mets paid that price. But also, it's just, I think about the logistics. Like, we don't always think about the reality. Yeah, the Cubs had a bunch of resources. They had Carter Hawkins and Hoyer and probably several assistants working the phones and everything on trade deadline day. But if you have the chance to get Urquidy for Contreras, you don't pull the trigger on something else while you wait to hear back on that. And if you only hear back with 10 minutes left and it's too late to really hold the Mets' feet to the fire, I'm sort of okay with Hoyer having been in a wait and see mode. And then, again, remembering that for Contreras, unlike maybe some other players that you might not have offered the QO to, you had this baseline of you're going to get a second round pick still. And maybe that's not awesome, but it's something. And so you didn't have to scramble and just trade him for whatever, knowing what he means to the franchise when the Urquidy thing didn't pan out. So I don't know. I think his trading style and philosophy is starting to come into focus for us. I think I'm more encouraged by it than I was a year ago, even. At the same time, yeah, you're right. This winter's the big test for me because I want to see if he has the gear of just being more aggressive in team building in general. I'm not yet sure he does, but he needs to.
And I think we can agree that free agency is not about, we talk about bargains in free agency, right? But free agency really, truly isn't about bargains. Free agency is about paying people who are good to play for you, and you pay them more than you would if they're under team control. I mean, they're just more expensive. That's the way it works. And whether or not he's willing to, as they say, overpay, although it's not really an overpay if people are willing to pay it, right?
Yeah, it sounds like market price to me.
Yeah, right. Yeah, is he willing to pay people large amounts of money under the theory that, well, statistically, looking at the numbers, like they won't be worth that much money, or they might not be worth that much money. And of course, if the Cubs had taken that approach with Lester and other players, where would they have been, right? Sometimes you have to take a chance. And sometimes it works out, like John Lester, and you win a World Series. Sometimes you get Jason Hayward, and you still win a World Series, but maybe it doesn't work out. I mean, that was probably in the 5% probability and badness in terms of how that deal worked out. But that doesn't mean that you don't make deals in the future. And at some point, this offseason, I think, too, they're going to have to spend some money. And they're going to have to spend a lot, like six-figure money on a player.
Yeah, let's speculate.
Nine figures. Sorry, six would be $100,000. That's not it. Nine figures.
Let's speculate a little bit about the spending. The quote is intelligent spending. That's what Carter Hawkins and Jed Hoyer will be doing this winter. They've got a lot of holes to fill, like you mentioned. I think top of the list here for Cubs fans, they're watching the race amongst available shortstops. So I know, Matt, you've dug deep into the shortstops available here. I think the top tier is that Carlos Correa, Xander Bogaerts, Trey Turner. I feel that all three will use the Cubs as leverage. The Cubs will not pay the prices commanded by those guys, and we end up with the Cubs signing Dansby
No,
Swanson.
no.
Tell me I'm wrong, Matt. Tell me I'm wrong.
And Matt, you're okay with this, I think, right? I'm not, though. But go ahead. Tell us why you're okay with this.
Oh, okay with the situation Jeremy just described?
Yeah, getting Swanson.
Oh, buddy, I'm not okay with that at all.
Good.
Because
No.
he's just coming off a career year. He's not a good hitter. The Cubs need offensive help everywhere. They can't afford. Like, they're not going to get an offensive center field. Like, at some point, you have to have somebody who's a good bat at the position, right?
Yeah. And so this gets back to Jed's philosophy and his very value-centered approach. I think he is coming into the winter going, out of these 4 shortstops, I want one. I'm not going to be shut out, but I might just sign whichever one I can get the best deal on relative to my evaluation of the player, which I understand for a couple of reasons. One being that they are not vastly different in perceived value, at least on a market level. And another being that, he's got history with Bogarts. There are different things that make different, each of them the best possible fit. So if you could get a really good value on one of them, it just might shift where you push your other resources, but you're going to spend elsewhere too to supplement whatever addition you make. So I get what he's thinking. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. That's not the way you should hand out $100 million contracts. And this is where they got in trouble in the last cycle. You can compare and contrast the 2 big contracts you guys just mentioned that define this past era. John Lester was a guy they knew well. It was a guy they trusted off the field every bit as much as on the field because they'd been through his whole career with him. They knew all of his skills. They courted him exhaustively and listened to what he had to say before coming up with their final offer too. Then there was Jason Hayward, who, by the way, is a great person off the field. I'm not besmirching that in any way. There was not a failure of work ethic or leadership there. But the thing is, they got Jason Hayward by sending a bid to his agent, and his agent sitting down with him at the table, and they picked the highest bid. That difference right there tells you everything. What you do when you need to hand out over $100 million to an elite guy who's going to become the face of your franchise on one side of the ledger or the other, run scoring or run prevention. What you do is take everything into account, identify the best guy, not the best possible value and not the guy who, actuarially should work out, who you can kind of reach by phone and, shoot something over to. You talk endlessly with your targets. You focus on one dude and then you pay what it takes to get him. That's how you have winning big money deals in free agency. And the one I would do that with in this market is Carlos Correa. He is the youngest, just like Hayward was. He's also the most well-rounded hitter. He's also the best leader, no question. And he's the best defender of the group, no question, not even close. Those are the main categories to me. I want to know who's the best overall hitter. I want to know who I can trust most off the field. I want to know who's youngest so that the aging curve and injury issues are potentially on his side. And I want to know who plays the best defensive shortstop. And the answer to all 4 is Carlos Correa. So there's no conversation to have here. There's no value shopping to do. You pay Carlos Correa. If it costs $350 million, and I know we say it all the time, it's not our money and it's easy to spend other people's. I don't care. If it was my money, if I had the Ricketts $1 billion, first of all, world be a better place. I'm not bragging. It's just true. But secondly, I would give a whole big chunk of it to Carlos Correa, and I wouldn't think twice. And I agree with you that the balance of probability would suggest that that's not what's going to end up happening, and it haunts my dreams.
Yeah, I worry that Correa is going to not do anything. He's not going to make any decisions until Bogarts or Turner are off the board. I think one of those 2 guys signs first, and he knows than what he knows what his asking price is, and his asking price either becomes a lot more reasonable for teams, or it's something that won't happen until Bogaerts or Turner come off first, and then I worry that they're going to get outbid, and that's how we end up in a Dansby Swanson situation.
I would say specifically, given Scott Boris's style, I think he'll wait for Trey Turner to sign somewhere, because he knows that Turner isn't going to end up really taking any of his main suitors for Bogaerts and Correa, who are both his clients, out of play. He's
Would
going to
you
wait
make a push for Turner if you were the Cubs?
I really like Trey Turner.
You can't teach speed, right?
Right.
That's what they always say.
I just also, one thing about the modern game is that speed doesn't pay that. It doesn't. When I was working up a piece on comparing the four, what I kept coming back to was like, I think Trey Turner's speed's going to hold up pretty well. But I'm not sure how much value it adds to his game even right now. Or if it adds as much as it added to the games of a Ricky Henderson or a Luke Brock. Not because the game is
he would have been sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, he would have been a star in the 1980s, right? Because he's a great hitter. He doesn't walk much, and he could steal like 70 bases back in the old days.
Right. He'd be running twice as much, and he might also get hurt, which is the thing. He did an interview with Tyler Kepner of the New York Times a few years ago. I think when he was still with Washington. I think the headline ended up being, Trey Turner is too good to steal 75 bases. Where the point was, in the modern game, everyone's aware of the real break-even rate of stealing bases. Not only the sabermetric, if you don't succeed at least 70% of the time, you're not really helping the team. Because Turner's always going to clear that bar, right?
He's like a 90% guy. He's crazy good.
But there's a reason he's 90 instead of like 80, which is that he runs selectively for a different reason too. Yeah. It's preservation. I'm not going to pop a hammy when the team needs my bat in the lineup and my glove in the lineup. My legs are a tertiary part of the value of my game. I can still use them to do impressive things, but they're not at the center of my play. But my thing then is, okay, if we're admitting that your legs are a tertiary part of your game, suddenly the other parts of your game are the parts that I need to compare directly to the other people on the market. And it doesn't compare that favorably. Like Carlos Correa, this is the one thing about him that drives me a little nuts. He's a very conservative and not even a very good base runner. So between him and Turner is about as big a difference as you can create, except it's just in that one little slice of the game, which only ends up being worth about 10 runs because Turner isn't as aggressive as he could be, because he's trying to stay on the field and stay on the field for years to come. So then I'm just comparing their bats and their gloves and, again, the off-field stuff, and it's all coming up Correa. So I wouldn't go real far after Turner. I don't get the sense that the Cubs will. I won't be mad if he's the guy that they end up with instead, whereas I probably would be pretty upset if they end up with Swanson and a medium amount with Bogaerts. But, again, I think what will happen is Turner signs first because Boris wants a number that he is not going to accept anything below for his, at least for Correa and probably for Bogaerts. Then I think he'll want to move to find Correa his landing spot and the massive number before Bogaerts, actually. That's usually the way he does it when he has multiple guys in one marketplace.
Yeah, because then you keep one other bidder competing against someone else for that big money contract.
Right. And for someone in Bogaerts, the market's just going to be that little bit more limited, I think, where he thinks, let me land Correa there and start to create a little bit of scarcity for my final big piece. So I
By the way,
speaking
of stolen bases, Correa, you just talked about. Do you know that Correa has fewer stolen bases in his career than Anthony Rizzo has since 2015 when Correa started?
I didn't specifically know that, but it doesn't surprise me. It really is. I mean,
Rizzo has twice as many stolen bases as Correa does in the last 7 years.
Yeah, he is quick more than fast. He also, I don't know if it was on a stolen base or if he was going first to third, but I think it was like 2018 that he broke his hand on a slide. And it really, after that, he was like, nope, not doing it. There's no, it's not worth the juice is not worth the squeeze. And it showed up in stolen bases. And again, even in taking the extra base on hits and stuff, it makes him a slightly incomplete player, but in a small way. And again, on balance, I'm okay with that. But yeah, it is. That's the hole in his game.
So you take Correa first. Would you take Bogart second or Turner second? Like in your wish list?
I think I'd probably take Bogart second because I would expect there to be a pretty significant gap between the two in terms of the deal they'll sign. If it's for the same money or in the same neighborhood, that's where I want Turner, because I trust the skills and the aesthetic value to me, which is not value to the team. But I like watching Trey Turner play a lot.
If all three are gone, would you take Swanson or would you just pass at that point?
That's where it
pass. They can't pass. They
Well,
can't
but
not sign somebody.
I feel like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they sign Dansby Swanson for some 6-year deal, paying him like $25 million a year, and then he performs the way I expect him to perform, then they'll just throw up their hands and say, well, look, see what happens when we try to sign free agents.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't want that either, right? Like, maybe start looking at other positions of need. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's so. I think what's interesting is when everything happens, how the dominoes start falling. If the main guys all started trending away from the Cubs, or actually signed away from the Cubs, and any of the elite starting pitchers on the market, be it Jacob deGrom, who I'm not a fan of bringing him in and investing in that health profile, but him or Justin Verlander or Carlos Rodon, if those guys are still on the market when the other three shortstops get snapped up, maybe you plunge your monetary resources into one of them, into another mid-rotation starter like a Kodai Senga, and then you, instead of signing Swanson, you take young players that aren't as important now that you've signed these headline starters, and you make a package for Sean Murphy from Oakland, and that solves your catcher problem, and it adds the big bat to your lineup, that kind of thing. But boy, that would take that. At that point, you're really, really threading a needle. So the thing to do, not to get repetitive, is to sign Carlos Correa.
Yes,
don't
please.
Get into this situation where you get into a very narrow lane and you have one way out, and it's a whole lot of maneuvering in a furious amount of time. Just sign Carlos Correa.
Yeah, one other position I wanted to talk about before we do touch a little bit more on pitching is center field. And the name that's been attached to a lot of speculation so far, Cody Bellinger, former Dodger, 2019. He won the MVP award at 23 years old.
Mickey Mantle, they were calling him.
He's been bad for years now. Do the Cubs really think that they can fix something mechanical that the Dodgers couldn't fix? Matt, what are your thoughts on Cody Bellinger at this point in his career?
I think it would take a special level of arrogance for any team, any of the other 29 teams to sign Cody Bellinger thinking they'll do something for him that the Dodgers haven't been able to, because they're the Dodgers. They are the best at this. They're the best at this, and it's not especially close. That said, sometimes a guy with you guys have seen Cody Bellinger, massive, beautifully gifted ball player who moves in a unique way, very complicated and troublesome swing. It's not all that shocking that he ran into issues with it, right? Sometimes a guy like that needs a different philosophy, not a better one. Just he needs to hear from someone else who's not locked into a particular organization's way of doing things that he's been doing for his whole professional career. I think that's how everybody's sort of viewing this. Not just the Cubs, but other teams interested in him are saying, we aren't necessarily going to outdo the Dodgers here. We're going to sign a guy for a price tag that'll be reasonable almost no matter what, because he plays a great defensive center field and can even flex to first base, which is a unique and nifty bit of versatility. And if we can put things together for him offensively, it's just going to be because he needed the change of scenery. And it won't be necessarily a super credit to our hitting development, but it'll still be really good for us. And if it doesn't pan out, then at least we got a good glove for a year, and he's going to move on at that point anyway, because he's looking to sign a deal to rebuild value and be a marquee free agent again next year.
He's only 27, so he's
right.
He's young enough that he can do that.
And the athleticism is off the charts. So somewhere in there, if you want to just rebuild from the ground up, he's kind of built a lot like Christian Yelich, with whom his, their peaks and valleys have almost perfectly aligned.
Except I've successfully cursed, by the way.
Yeah, you've done a pretty good job.
Thank you.
But
I appreciate it.
He's like 5 years younger than Yelich, too. So he has time, and he hasn't had quite the injury issues that Yelich has had, where you could see him putting things back together. It's just at this point going to take a total reinvention. So I think the idea of signing him isn't to outsmart anyone. It's just to grab a guy on a short-term deal who shores up your defense, and then whatever offense he provides is gravy.
Do you think he is – so fill in the blank on this sentence. Cody Bellinger would be the best defensive Cubs center fielder since –
Ooh, I think about this stuff a lot. The Cubs and center field, there's a bugaboo there. Like,
yeah.
For a 150-year-old franchise, we're still waiting on their franchise center fielder in a lot of ways. Best defensive center fielder, I think, since Corey Patterson.
Yeah.
I think
better than a Michael Tucker, better than a Brian McRae. I could go on.
Juan Pierre.
Yeah.
Juan Pierre. Who's a
I was really so. My new thing is to watch old games on YouTube. That's how I've decided to pass this winter.
Okay.
And Brian McRae was fun. Like, a guy would hit a single at a pretty good pace up the middle and McRae would charge it and field it barehand, like he was going to come up fire into first or something. I never saw it burn him, but I wonder every time, buddy, you're not in a hurry here. It wasn't like
when he was a Cub, I actually lived in the right center field bleachers. One section over from the green out, area there, right? The small section right next to it. I spent a lot of my time with Brian. We hung out probably for, I don't know, upwards of 70 or 80 games together. And I thought he was a ton of fun. He was fun with the fans too.
Oh yeah. He was one of my first favorite players. And I still, kind of lament the trade that sent him away. It sort of worked out for the 98 Cubs, but it was short-sighted in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, the Cubs haven't had especially a lot of great defensive center fielders. Even when they get good production from the spot, it tends to be guys who other teams weren't comfortable having in center anymore, but the Cubs could do it because Wrigley's center field is kind of cozy.
And they had Kenny Lofton that 1 year, half a year after Corey Patterson got hurt.
Yeah.
Again, got injured running to first base. Not to bring that a sad topic up again, but yeah.
I did want to touch on a couple of the pitching pieces. I liked what you said earlier, Matt, about some of the big free agents that are out there. I'm seeing from Sahadev Sharma, friend of the podcast, and Patrick Mooney, another friend of the podcast, that they're reporting that the Cubs are looking at folks like Chris Bassett, Tajon Walker, in addition to being in on Senga from Japan here. Does Does this mean that they're already out on these top tier pitchers?
Yeah, I'm not sure how in they are on those top tier guys anyway. I almost think it would have to be a situation where they started not liking what they were hearing from the big shortstops before they jumped in seriously with the top end of the market. Because the top end of the pitching market has gotten a little crazy lately. Like Garrett Cole getting 9 and 324 when the market wasn't even all that hot otherwise, was one sign. And then what Max Scherzer signed for last year, was it 3 years and $123 million? That's a lot. That's a lot. I'm not saying that you can't be worth it. And again, I'm a proponent of spending what it takes when it's a player you really believe in. But that top end makes me a little nervous, especially given that we know the Ricketts are never going to go in for unbounded spending. It's not like spending $40 million on Justin Verlander for the Cubs would not be the same thing as spending $43 million on Max Scherzer for the Mets, because Tom Ricketts ain't Steve Cohen. In some ways he is, but not in the right ways. So I think I have always been a guy who sort of doesn't mind the flat starting rotation as much as other people do. I don't have to, before I start sweating who's my game 1 starter and who's my game 2 starter and how are they going to match up with the other teams, I want to get to a game 1 and a game 2, and having 5 or even 6 solid, I know they're going to be above average starting pitchers is very valuable in its own sort of different way. The
Phillies got to the World Series with that this year.
An 87-win team. I mean, this is the new normal now, right, in baseball, in the playoffs, where we're just getting in. Like Theo used to always talk about, if you get into the playoffs, you have a lottery ticket, right? Well, now even more so than ever before, strange things can happen and teams can get hot at the right time. And these short series are really conducive to maybe inferior teams forming over the course of 72 hours, or 48 hours, and there you go.
And I also think, I'm a little higher on Hayden Wesneski than your average person is.
I think the average person's pretty high on him, don't you think?
Yeah, hopefully.
On Twitter,
at this
they
point.
Sure are. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot to like there. There's still things to be ironed out, and what he showed in the majors isn't necessarily all sustainable. There are adjustments he's still going to have to make. But in Wisniewski, in Stroman, in Justin Steele, I think they already have 3 guys who, on a given day, can pitch against most game 1, game 2 starters. They're not going to be projected to outpitch a guy like Garrett Cole,
sure,
but they'll keep you in the game. And those 3, plus a guy you hope is going to have a bounce back in Kyle Hendricks. And if you just add, well, look, we don't have to be overly optimistic, but he, at the very worst, if Kyle Hendricks is your 5 starter eating some innings, that's not such a bad outcome. And if you add a guy who pushes Steele and Wisniewski down to the 3 and 4 slots in your rotation, even if it leaves Marcus Stroman as your nominal ace, if it's a guy like Senga, if it's a guy like Chris Bassett, Taijuan Walker and Stroman, first of all, were tight when they were both on the Mets in 2019 and 2020. Secondly, one thing about Stroman is that before he went to the Mets, he was a Blue Jay for his whole career. Walker, before getting to the Mets, had been a Blue Jay, had gone through the Blue Jays in sort of the revival and resurrection of his career. The Blue Jays are one of those teams. They're teams who are very good at pitching development and can fix guys in the major leagues, right? There are several of those teams. Not all of them have a track record of when that guy then leaves, he thrives elsewhere. But the Blue Jays, I find, do. The things they implement, whether it's the way they communicate with a guy such that he really understands why he's doing things differently, or whether it's they're making different changes than other teams are making, and it's stuff that can just, port more naturally to someone else's system. one way or another, Blue Jays guys they improve and they stay improved. So I would trust Walker as as long as he's healthy, he's going to be a mid-rotation type of pitcher. I would trust Bassett just because he's a veteran who's been solid for a few years now. Now, I want to see what that contract would look like because I'm reluctant to give up a draft pick for a Chris Bassett, but that's a separate consideration. I think.
So say hypothetically the Cubs get one of those guys, and then for their other starting pitching slot, they connect on a Drew Smiley deal or something like that. Is
Right.
that now you've got basically a bunch of guys, but you need a bunch of guys. I mean, any going into any season with fewer than 7 or 8 starting pitching options is problematic, right? Like, it's nice to have Keegan Thompson in the bullpen because that way, in an emergency, you can stretch him out and make him a starter for a couple weeks or whatever, with injuries and whatnot. So there are ways you can play that. You've got guys in the minors like Assad and people like that who you might be able to bring up, but I feel like you still need a couple more guys just from a depth standpoint, at the major league level. So is that, and again, I feel like we're kind of going down to the second tier here, but if you can get one of the 3 big shortstops and you can get Senga, say, and Smiley, something like that, and at least get a catcher, whether it's Vasquez or one of the bigger names, who knows, through trade, are you going to have enough to be in that 87 to 89 win stretch, or what you still need? Obviously, you'll need some sort of a center fielder, but offensively and starting pitching wise, are you there then? Like, how close are you?
Yeah, I think so. Say everything you just said comes to fruition. They add a couple of starters to the depth chart. You got your shortstop locked in. You've got catcher and center field figured out defensively, at least. To me, it all then hinges on how well did you add one more bat.
What do you think about Jose Abreu as a possible bat?
I like it. I think that's a good one. I think, first of all, first base and DH both being available can save his legs a little bit, can allow you to sort of hedge against whatever uncertainty you have. And I think we all still need to have plenty about Matt Mervis. So, if Mervis isn't really panning out, you can have Abreu playing first a lot. You can have Patrick Wisdom, he's no great shakes, but he adds real power to especially if you can have him in sort of the lower third of your order. So Abreu would solve the problem. I think they kind of missed an opportunity when the Twins decided to unload Gio Urshela, who's a underrated hitter, not at all like Patrick Wisdom. He's sort of the opposite of Patrick Wisdom, in that he's just a really well-rounded hitter who can also play third base. The Twins decided to unload him for almost nothing, and the Cubs sort of missed that boat. But they're still
right in their price point. That's a shame they missed that.
Well, he is going to cost the Angels about $9 million now in arbitration. So maybe
that's basically like that's like an Anderson Simmons VR combination, right? Like $9 million. So
but packed into one roster spot, and
right.
At this point, their talent packed into one player too. So
right.
I want to see who the other bat that they get is. Neither Bellinger nor Kevin Kiermaier would count as a bat. Neither Christian Vasquez nor Omar Narvaez would count as a bat. But there's got to be a bat. And I saw a report over the holiday weekend that they were interested in Michael Conforto, and maybe it was Brandon Nimmo. It was Conforto and someone else who's sort of in that left-handed outfield market, which is interesting. I'm not sure exactly what the plan would be then. Surely you're not signing Conforto, was already stretched whenever the Mets put him in center, and that was 2 years ago. And, he's had an injury since then, and now you're going to send him out to center. But
he wasn't particularly good that 2 years ago when he did play also. It's right in 2021. 2020 was the last good season he had. Not that it's that long ago, but still missing a whole season. There's still questions there. I feel like the nice part about going after um, uh, Abreu is that although he's old, right? He's going to be 36 next month, 2 months from now.
He's
He's
that's
pretty
with an
consistent.
asterisk. That's with a
Yeah,
probably 36
but
ish.
he's probably going to be put up good numbers, and God knows what would drive White Sox fans nuts. But that's the least of my concerns. But he'd be a veteran who's probably going to produce for you with maybe his ceiling and floor are very close together. I think, at least for next year.
Yeah. And
So,
I trust him to produce in whatever different way. Like he's
right.
been a just turn and launch the ball slugger. He also last year, I think just because the White Sox felt like they needed something different, he sort of eased off the pedal in terms of power, but
right.
started drawing
Got
a
on
lot
base
of walks.
a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I like that guy. I like the flexibility of his offensive profile. I think he'd be a really good fit in the clubhouse too. I mean, this is a clubhouse that still everybody likes. Nico Horner and Ian Happ and Marcus Stroman. I'm not knocking any of that, but I don't think yet there's a sense that they have that warrior who walks in and everyone's head turns and this is the guy we follow, onto the field today. And hopefully that's Carlos Correa. That's the swagger he brings wherever he goes. But if you end up with a Trey Turner, he doesn't have that same kind of swagger. Even Xander Bogaerts really doesn't. And even if you do have Correa, it's not going to hurt to have a second guy who brings that same energy.
Well, the nice thing about Abreu, if you have Correa, is that he's not going to show Correa up on the base paths either. So that goes for you.
Yeah, it starts to get a little worrisome at a certain point. And then you think about okay, but the youth movement's on his way, and it's Brennan Davis, who I know we're not supposed to call it a back injury, but the man's he is technically going to be a rookie and everything. He's also already hobbling around a little bit.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Speaking of real quick, just as a complete aside, when it comes to the Cubs prospects, they've got this deep, great farm system, but whenever people get ready to join the major league club, something happens and they don't. Who do you see, if anybody, helping out this year from the minors? I mean, Mervis maybe, I guess, because he'll have an opportunity to. Yeah. Do you see anybody else coming up and making anybody who we haven't seen already, coming up and making a mark potentially?
Well, if they invest enough, if they invest what we have just talked about as enough this year, hopefully most of the roles that would be available are sort of secondary type of roles. And then I think guys like Daniel Palencia, who I talked about earlier, or a guy like Ryan Jensen, whom they added to the 40-man, who has still been starting, but I think could very quickly become a nasty relief weapon. I think we could finally...
is probably, where they might make some hay, right? In terms of bringing guys up.
Yeah. And then my one guy on the positional side, or not on the positional side, but just outside of the bullpen, the guy I think who could sort of surprise us and make an impact is Jordan Wicks. If he has some good runway of health and what he's been working on sort of consolidates quickly the way you sort of expect it to in the second full professional season for a college draftee as a lefty starter, I think he could take off and he could force his way into your rotation plans, or just, it's June and Kyle's shoulder just hasn't done what we hoped it was going to do. And now he's got to go back on the shelf for a while and we might not see him again. It might be Jordan Wicks who steps into that void and does something really impressive. So
that'd be nice.
That's what I'd be looking at. I don't think there's any position player at this point that you want to be counting on. And I know that the Cubs feel the same way, because they won't shut up about needing a center fielder. And Brendan Davis is standing right there going, hey, guys. Hey, guys.
Right.
So,
well, and that's why the 1-year deal makes sense at center field. But
exactly.
Do you see any possibility that a Miguel Amaya might A, be healthy, and B, make it to the major leagues at some point this season?
I arrived at a point. I don't know how you guys feel about this stuff, but maybe it's a heart guarding kind of thing. I arrived at a point a little while ago where I want to hedge on the side of thinking of what a prospect gives me as gravy. If once a guy shows me a couple of warts or has a couple of turns of misfortune, I'm not going to count on him anymore. And if he pops back up and suddenly things are breaking right for him again, I'm going to love it. But I don't want to be leaning on it. That's where I got to with Amaya a year ago. And at this point, what I'm saying is I do think there could still be value, especially in the bat. That's the only thing I envision as if he makes an impact on the Chicago Cubs for the better in 2023, I think it has to be like in the second half as a DH. I don't think you're going to see him be the level of, I mean, God knows, guy, we just watched them spend 2 years awkwardly waving goodbye to Wilson Contreras when he didn't want to leave because they valued defense at catcher so much. Amaya's always been fringy in that regard. And now he's dealing, he's had an elbow injury and an ankle injury. And how many of those are you supposed to withstand when already your defensive profile wasn't great? I don't think he's a long-term catcher for the organization. I don't really think he's a long-term impact player for the organization. But if I'm wrong about either of those things, I won't be wrong about it by the end of this coming calendar year. What he could do is be an important supplemental player, kind of like when Kyle Schwarber came up in 2015. And he was the 10th regular, but he was providing a jolt on the offensive side for the lineup that they needed.
Well, we've got a lot to watch as the winter unfolds to see how the Cubs handle this offseason, these free agents, all the holes we ran down. There's a lot of work coming up. We will be here podcasting about it as soon as news happens. We'll be here, so make sure you continue to stay subscribed to this podcast. But while people are waiting for things to happen this winter, Pat, what could they be doing at Wrigley Field?
Well, Jeremy, there is the Winter Wonder World land at Wrigley Field this year. It's quite the production. I was able to go to the neighborhood night last week, and some of you may be familiar with, in years past, the Cubs on the, I always call it the Triangle lot, but I know they have a
Gallagher Way now.
Gallagher Way, yeah, whatever. Okay, so at Gallagher Way, the last several years, the Cubs have put up an ice skating rink and Kris Kringle market booths that you can buy food and beverages and knickknacks from, and it's been nice. It's been fine. We've gone there every year. This year, however, in fact, I was there when I think the Cubs signed Brandon Morrow. Fun fact. This year, the Cubs have taken it a step further and have removed the ice skating rink from Gallagher Way to put in more of the booths. So there's just tons of booths for the Kris Kringle market. And now you can go inside the ballpark, and the entire field is covered by, I think they're Legos, basically. I don't know. It feels like Legos that you stand on, but you've got a huge ice skating rink. You've got a 4-person toboggan slide. You've got bumper cars. You've got a tilt-a-whirl. You've got a teacup ride. You've got chalets people can rent out for 2 hours at a time. You've got s'mores kits and open fire pits that you can cook them on. You've got a big sort of warming tent, they call it, which is another term for bar. And the place is just, and they've got places to take pictures, like in sleds and huge sleds, right, oversized sleds, and all kinds of stuff. It's really, it's like an amusement park. And I'm not a big amusement park person in general, but I do have to say it's pretty cool to be in Wrigley Field and kind of wandering around and having the kids on rides and things like that, while you kind of take in the fact that you're at a major league ballpark. I mean, for many people, I think, I certainly, when I was young, I didn't get a chance to go on the field, but and now I kind of take it for granted a little bit. But for people who haven't ever been on the field at Wrigley, whether you're on Lego bricks or whether you're on grass, just being in the ballpark and looking around from the vantage point of being on the field at the stands and at the scoreboard and at the scenery, I think is a good experience to have. And so I give it 2 thumbs up. I will tell you, they're making a ton of money on this. It is packed every day. I go by there at lunchtime, it's packed. Nighttime, it's packed. I think they're going to probably clear like at least $10 million. And I think that Drew Smiley will probably be the beneficiary of this. Isn't that how that works? Every dollar that goes in, they spend.
That's what we were told. Everything that they've done around the neighborhood, that just goes right back into the team, in the payroll. Yeah.
But I do recommend going if people are around. It's a lot of fun. I will tell you that it's not, purchasing things. Things are not cheap. I mean, partially because of inflation, partially because they can charge whatever they want, basically. But like my daughter is in love with the crepes there, so we have to go get crepes. But crepes are $12, which is but we've gotten 2 crepes in the first 9 days of Winter Wonderland, because you can get them at the outdoor booth there in the Gallagher Way. But there's a lot to do there and to see. So that's what's going on. Hopefully the stadium will be that full in April when all the new Cubs players arrive from various other free agent destinations. I do have one last thing for you, though, Jeremy.
Yeah, we have time for one last thing, and then we're going to wrap it up this week.
This is our moment of zen here, Matt. You might appreciate this. And the topic of today's moment of zen is Christian Yelich. This is just for you, Matt. I thought you'd appreciate this. So last year, Christian Yelich set a personal record in what statistical category?
Grounded into double plays.
Sadly, no. He didn't make enough contact to do that. The answer is strikeouts. He had 162. Yes, you were 162 strikeouts, which is 25 more than he's ever had in a season. And that 162 strikeouts, that number 162 rang a bell to me. And I was like, where do I know that number from? Then I remembered the Milwaukee Brewers owe Christian Yelich $162 million still. So for the remainder of his contract. So in honor of his 31st birthday coming up next week, I think the moment of zen tonight is for Christian Yelich.
Always fun, and we'll have plenty more Yelich stats as the year rolls on. With that, we're going to call it a podcast. I can't believe how time flies. We're already an hour in, Matt. Always so much fun catching up with you and talking Cubs and talking baseball. Please remind our listeners where they can follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, I am at MA Trueblood on Twitter, doing a few things, not as much writing as I used to. But what I do write, I will post there. I also want to give a quick plug. I am now doing this from behind enemy lines. Me and one of my friends since high school, and my dad and one of his friends since high school have started a Cubs podcast too.
What?
Yeah, we are 6 episodes in, so not quite 300, but we're coming up on you guys. It's called This Is Not a Rebuild, because nothing ever is, right? You can follow that on Twitter at Not a Rebuild, or check it out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's weird, man. We follow the trail wherever it goes. You guys will appreciate it. One episode centered largely on Rick Russell. We did a radio play this week.
All-time great Cubs, by the way.
Yeah.
Highly, criminally underrated, potentially Hall of Fame worthy. But anyway.
We discussed that and found some surprising evidence in favor of it. So that kind of stuff, it's not newsy. It's rarely as analytical as we've even gotten during this episode. But if people like Cubs talk and, hearing people sort of shoot the breeze during a long winter, we're having a lot of fun with it. So you can check that out as well.
That's awesome.
So you've tricked me, Matt, because you have distracted me by having me read your weekly musings in your emails, which I subscribe to. And I didn't realize you also were doing a podcast.
In fairness, I linked to the podcast in a couple of those. So I know you haven't been reading every day, Pat.
I have been reading them, but I wasn't really pay attention to the link stuff.
Yeah,
but they are interesting.
Yeah,
and speaking of going all over the place, you really take some turns on those too, I might add.
Yeah. My new thing ever since I stopped writing about baseball, like on even a semi-regular basis for money, is that when I talk or write, I'm just going to let it really loose. Whatever level of holding certain things back or staying real close to a certain set of tracks that I used to do is out the window now. So yeah, it gets both in my newsletter and on the other podcast, it gets a little weird, but usually in good ways, I think, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So.
No, definitely looking forward to checking that out. Recommend everyone give that a follow as well. So yeah, no, always great to catch up with you, Matt. You can also follow us on Twitter at Wrigleyville Nat, the same for Instagram, and Facebook.com.
For as long as it exists.
Facebook.com/Wrigleyville Nation as well. We have a TeePublic shop. That's the best way to support us, is to go buy some merchandise. The link is pinned to the top of our Facebook page, our Twitter, and it's in the link tree in our Instagram bio as well. You can just click there, buy yourself some merch. I just uploaded new t-shirt designs. We've got new t-shirt designs up there. You can get mugs, stickers, all kinds of stuff. For Wrigleyville Nation, that's helps supports the show. So go check out the new designs and the new logos over at the TeePublic shop. As soon as I put them up, we started selling some shirts right away, and people are digging the new logos. You can pick what color you want to put the logos on. It's a fun shopping experience over there at the TeePublic shop. So definitely give us a purchase over there to support the show. And make sure you stay subscribed to the podcast, because we're going to drop in occasionally like we are now. No defined schedule here for the offseason. So definitely make sure you're subscribed. Tell your Cub fan friends about the show. If you can't support us financially through the store, make sure you're spreading the word about the podcast, showing your friends how to subscribe to the podcast, because Cub fans know other Cub fans. So make sure you're helping them subscribe to the podcast. That is another way to support us as we will roll into our 300th episode, our 10th season covering the Cubs. And make sure that you stay tuned for all of that fun. And with that, we're going to call it a podcast. We're wrapping it up for this week. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And we'll talk to you again next time.